Gentleman yields. I recognize Mr. Bishop from North Carolina.
I thank the chairman, and I think this is interesting, and it begins to ferret out what really is the key issue that this Congress needs to focus on in regards to the matter that's being testified to. And I appreciate the witnesses who are here. You're professional and dispassionate. I think almost no one is brazen enough anymore to deny that there's a border crisis created by the Biden administration. Secretary Mayorkas, Border Chief Ortiz admitted such on the way out the door. FEMA announced yesterday the distribution of more than $290 million in congressional funding to communities receiving migrants. You don't deploy FEMA resources when there isn't a crisis. But the issue here, and I agree, it shouldn't be political theater. It's not about policy differences, can't be. The issue here is vindicating the rule of law and the constitutional role and lawmaking power of Congress. Many claim the Trump indictment is about the rule of law. The ranking member says appropriately policy differences are of a different dimension, and I agree with that. And the appropriate response for Congress is different in each case. I don't even think, with all respect to the chairman, that our focus can be exactly on dereliction in the full sense articulated, because dereliction is willful or negligent. And what we need to focus on here is whether this is not a case of negligence. If it were, the implications would be different. The remedy would be different. Incompetence in administering a federal agency is maladministration, and the recourse falls to the people alone. But intentional sabotage of the rule of law is something entirely different. It is an affront to the separation of powers, to the institutional authority of the Congress under the Constitution, and it invites another remedy, and that is impeachment. Secretary Wolf, the ranking member, attacked actions by the Trump administration, but you point, your statement, really elegant, 10 pages, covers a lot of ground. I urge people to look at it carefully. You point out that you were attacked for by the ranking member. These were exercises of authority specifically granted to Congress. Take migrant protection protocols, remain in Mexico. You cite 235B2C of the INA. In the case of an alien described in subparagraph A, that's somebody who would have right otherwise to asylum, claim of asylum, who is arriving on land from a foreign territory contiguous to the United States, the Attorney General may return that alien to that territory pending a proceeding under Section 1229A of this title. So that's exactly what you did. Whether somebody said you did it in an exact way or if you want to challenge how you were exercising an authority. Same thing with safe third country agreements under Section 208A2A, and I won't read all that. But here's what you point out, the violations of law, several of these found by federal district judges at this point in time, by the catch and release, ignores the mandate to detain or make them wait, an asylum applicant wait in Mexico. That's been judged by Judge Wetherill in Florida to be unlawful. The use of notices, what are they called, NTRs, Mr. Wolf?
Notices to report.
Notices to report. So you don't even have any formal commencement of removal proceedings, which a notice to appear would be, setting a date, even though you never get to them. They don't even do it. They just let them go with NTRs. The exercise of authority to adjudicate asylum by DHS officials, maybe Mr. Edlow, you may have pointed this out in your testimony, instead of in the Department of Justice where that power is reserved. An interior non-enforcement policy, Mr. Wolf, you pointed out the 100-day deportation freeze. Judge Tipton said that was illegal. Subsequent enforcement priorities established that exempt 99% from the threat of deportation. Secretary Mayorkas declaring that illegal presence alone is not grounds for removal. More than 1 million in the country subject to final removal orders, and they said they're not going to remove them. So I'm just going to leave my last minute to you, Mr. Wolf, but I see what we're talking about is intentional sabotage of the rule of law as set by Congress, and that's a different ballgame.
It is different. It's not just about whether or not illegal aliens can claim asylum, as was talked about here earlier. As you indicated, at least in my written testimony, there's 7 different instances where I believe the law is not being faithfully executed, to include the categorical parole, which was the last one there.
And I didn't get to that.
Which is at ports of entry, which is at the heart of all of this. To have asylum needs to be an urgent humanitarian benefit or advantageous somehow to the United States. Simply paroling up to 360,000 individuals, which is what they are on track to do per year, violates the letter of the law. It's very clear.
Final point here is that it does fall to Congress, as well as these judges, fall to Congress through the impeachment power to decide whether the law has been intentionally flouted. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Swalwell from California.
I've heard the phrase rule of law and accusations that the Biden administration is sabotaging the rule of law. And the title of this hearing is Secretary Mayorkas's dereliction of duty on the border crisis. But I think in contrast to that, it's very interesting to me that the chief witness that the majority has called here, Mr. Wolf, was found on November 14, 2020 by a federal judge to, quote, not lawfully be serving as acting secretary. Not lawfully serving as acting secretary. So a lot of considerations and concerns from my colleague across the aisle about the rule of law, but the witness that they called served unlawfully is the acting secretary of Homeland Security, where an accusation of dereliction of duty is being made today. In addition to that, again, it's interesting that this is the chief witness that they've called today, because on September 17, 2020, the unlawfully serving acting secretary, Mr. Wolf, failed to honor his congressional subpoena. Didn't show up, skipped the hearing. So you have someone who's acting unlawfully and somebody who skips a congressional subpoena, and we're going to be lectured by the majority about a dereliction of duty of the current lawfully serving, Senate-confirmed Secretary of Homeland Security. I think that's interesting and an important perspective that we should have as we consider what's going on at our southern border. Ms. Acer, I want to speak with you just about what is going on at the southern border. And if you were to think about the migrants who are fleeing the Northern Triangle, who leave everything they know, their family, their livelihood, their culture, their homes, their community, their churches, and take the journey to America, do you believe that if we were to find a way as a global alliance, public-private partnerships, to help invest in those countries in their economic security and their physical security, and stand up and support a rule of law and go after corruption, that would reduce the number of people who came to the United States?
Absolutely. I mean, the reason that people are coming here to seek protection is because they're not being protected at home by their countries. There's a lot more that the United States can do to increase respect for human rights and to otherwise assist in making sure that conditions allow people who can stay safely in their home countries to do so.
And I understand, the counter to that will be, well, why would we invest money there if we have needs here? And there's no doubt we have needs here. But if we're going to be spending the money anyway, either enforcement of the border or taking care of people who come here, to me it just seems like a better holistic investment to try and work private sector, public sector, nonprofit, NGOs in those countries to stand up, as I said, economic and physical security. Also wanted to ask, what effect do you think it has, Ms. Acer, when my colleagues across the aisle and Republicans say that we have open borders? And in fact, the title of the hearing today is Open Borders, Closed Case. Do you think if you are south of our border and you're looking for somewhere to go to keep your family safe and to find some livelihood, if you hear people falsely declaring that the border's open, do you think that makes you more or less likely to try and go to the United States because you think the border's open?
I don't know how much migrants actually listen to, to these hearings, but you're right in that I've heard Mexican officials say they wished that U.S. politicians would actually stop saying that the border was open because they thought that was really sending the wrong message. And sometimes disinformation and inaccurate information does get into Facebook groups that many migrants do follow.
Thank you, Ms. Acer. And I think the lesson here is that this issue is complicated. It involves human beings who are leaving everything. We've got our own struggles in the United States, and clearly, cannot take on, a consistent flow from the southern border. But it needs solutions, not theater. And I'm afraid that my colleagues are interested in the crisis, but they're not interested in the solutions. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Jimenez from Florida for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Acer, you were quoted in the Baptist News Global referring to the end of Title 42, and you said that the dangers facing asylum seekers are more acute than they were years ago when the Trump administration started these policies, and these policies have contributed to a worsening of the conditions that face migrants and people seeking asylum. Did you make that statement?
I don't remember my exact words, but I probably did.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wolf, I believe, like my colleagues, that I don't believe that Mr. Mayorkas is incompetent. I think that he is derelict in his duty because I think everything that he's done is actually done on purpose. Do you share that view?
I do. This is by design.
Right. And so when, I've been an administrator, and when I've made mistakes and I listen to my folks and say, hey, why didn't that go the way that I wanted it to? I would listen and say and kind of change things. But Mr. Mayorkas kind of doubles down. And so when in the first days of the Biden administration, a bunch of policies that the Trump administration had put in place in order to secure the border were overturned, and then things started to go south in a really big way. Do you know firsthand if people in the border, that Customs Border Patrol agents actually advised Mr. Mayorkas that, hey, you need to reverse these policies to stop this, this tidal wave that's coming into the United States?
Again, I wasn't there. It's my understanding that they did. Chief Scott was there in the Border Patrol advising the Biden administration, so I'm sure he can answer.
Well, Mr. Scott, can you answer that question?
Yeah, he was informed verbally, he was informed in writing. I think it's important for everybody to understand everything fundamentally changed. When I worked for Secretary Wolf, we had team meetings. We were asked for our input. We were told over your career what works and what doesn't work. On January 20th, 2021, that all got shut off. DHS, the Secretary even went to the step of shutting down the integrated teams of career professionals that were brought into DHS ops to provide guidance. Our input was no longer solicited, and when my team and I gave it unsolicited, we were basically put in a box. They did not want to know what we had to say. They made it very clear, expedite processing and find new ways to let migrants into the U.S. That was the only agenda.
Exactly, which is on purpose, really circumventing U.S. law.
100% on purpose, scripted out, and the Secretary is not incompetent.
No, I know he's not incompetent. He's derelict, without a doubt. Mr. Wolf, back to you. When you had the Remain in Mexico policy, and people were told to remain in Mexico, and then they had their asylum hearings, what percentage of those that were seeking asylum were actually granted asylum?
Again, it would have been under that about 10 to 15%. The number that grant asylum has been holding for years now. About 80 to 85% do not qualify, and about 10 to 15% do qualify, and we saw that again under MPP as well.
All right, so those are the people that actually qualify to get into the United States, are granted, paroled into the United States, given some kind of legal status in the United States because they actually have a valid asylum claim. Now, when you get rid of that, and then you allow them to come into the United States, and then you don't, well, the law also says that if you're seeking your asylum, you're supposed to be detained until your hearing, correct?
Correct.
That's not happening right now, is it?
It is not.
Okay, so now you've got all the people who are coming into the United States. They're actually being granted, entry into the United States. So you're actually increasing the number of migrants entering the United States illegally, because they don't really have a valid asylum claim, by about 80%. Would you agree with that number?
That sounds about right.
Okay, and so we don't even know where they are. We don't know where some of them are being tracked, some of them are not being tracked. We don't know where 85,000 children are at this point. I consider that to be a dereliction of duty. Children, 85,000, we don't know where they are. Did that ever happen under the Trump administration?
85,000? No, absolutely not. Again, you have an unaccompanied alien child crisis at the moment, 380,000. And so when if you happen to go to the baseball game tonight, that fills National Stadium almost 9 times. That's how many children that have come across that border that have no parent, have no guardian, that have been smuggled by these Mexican cartels at the behest sometimes of their parents, because they know that if they get across that border, they will remain here in the United States. And it is a terrible journey. You are subjecting them to just horrific conditions, and it needs to end.
And the Democrats dare to call what happened during the Trump administration inhumane. My time is up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Goldman of New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our witnesses were asked whether what Secretary Mayorkas has done is intentional. Obviously, it's intentional. He's not doing things unintentionally. And he has testified before us, and he has acknowledged repeatedly that we are dealing with a very difficult situation at the border. I want to focus on, go back to what my colleague, Mr. Swalwell, was focusing on, which is my friend, Mr. Bishop's quote that there is an intentional sabotage of the rule of law. Now, we've heard a couple times today that the GAO and a federal court found that Mr. Wolf was acting unlawfully. To my understanding, that would be a violation of the rule of law. But let's focus a little bit on some policies and some efforts. Mr. Jimenez mentioned that there are children who cannot be found, which brings up, of course, the Trump administration family separation policy. Mr. Wolf, when you were the chief of staff to the Secretary of Homeland Security, isn't it true that you supported the family separation policy?
I was at the department from 2017 to the end of the administration.
Well, did you not, according to an Inspector General's report, urge the counselor to the Attorney General to implement the family separation policy, to increase prosecution of family unit parents and separate family units?
No, I don't believe. No.
Okay, well, I want to introduce into the record this Inspector General's report on family separation, which includes an email by you to Gene Hamilton, the counselor to the Attorney General.
So that email had a number of options
hold on.
for consideration. There was no direction. There was no direct tip.
So you're saying right here, right now, that you did not support the family separation policy.
That was not
Is
your
that your
question.
testimony?
That was not your question.
I'm asking it right now. Is that your testimony?
We implemented a number of policies in the administration. I agreed with President Trump when he ended zero tolerance in June, I believe, of 2018.
Did you
Absolutely.
support the family separation policy?
Again,
As
we
the
had
chief
no
of
we
staff?
had no family separation policy at the department.
Really? The department did not?
Now, I'm happy to go through this.
All right,
Attorney General
let's talk
announced
about
a
this.
zero tolerance policy that the
Let's
department
talk about
then
this.
implemented.
One sec. Let's talk about this, because the facts are that more than 5,000 children were forcibly separated from their parents at the border. And the reason is because the Department of Justice, for the first time, used Title 8, United States Code, Section 1325, which makes it a misdemeanor offense to charge anyone crossing without without papers, etc. That had never been used before, because the only point of that is to put parents who are charged with that in jail where they cannot actually be with their families. Now, a federal court in 2018 ended the family separation policy, which this court determined that there was, because the government's policy, quote, shocks the conscience, unquote, and violates the constitutional right to family integrity. There are still children who were separated at the border from their parents who have not been found because this zero tolerance policy, which ultimately ended up separating parents and children, did not create any mechanism to account for that separation in order to track the children. Now, that clearly, as a judge said, was a violation of the rule of law, an intentional sabotage of the rule of law. Let me go quickly to another one. According to a whistleblower complaint by the former head of the department's intelligence branch, Mr. Wolf ordered him to withhold an intelligence notification on Russian activities because it, quote, made the president look bad. The Office of Inspector General investigated it and found that the department did not adequately follow its internal processes and policy standards when editing and disseminating an intelligence product regarding Russian interference with the 2020 presidential election. And the acting secretary, Mr. Wolf, participated in that review process. Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up. I'd like to introduce for the record that Inspector General's report, which my staff will give. And I would like to note that before we start attacking this intentional sabotage of the rule of law, we ought to look in our own glass house. And I yield.
Without objection,